The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I stood in the doorway of Ethan's room, watching the morning light filter through his blinds. He'd left for school 20 minutes ago, but his presence still lingered in the unmade bed, the scattered textbooks, and that familiar scent of teenage boy mixed with cheap cologne. I'd been putting off this cleaning session for weeks, maybe months, but something about today felt different. Maybe it was the way he'd avoided my eyes at breakfast, or how he'd been spending more time locked away in here lately. As a single mother in Pueblo, Colorado, I'd learned to trust my instincts, and right now, every maternal alarm bell in my head was ringing. I stepped into the room, my bare feet sinking into the carpet that desperately needed vacuuming, and surveyed the chaos that was my 17-year-old son's personal space. The usual suspects were scattered across his desk: energy drink cans, crumpled homework assignments, and gaming controllers tangled in their cords like electronic spaghetti. I started with the obvious things first, gathering dirty clothes that had somehow migrated from his hamper to every corner of the room. Each sock I picked up, each t-shirt I folded, felt like a small act of love, even though I knew he'd never notice or appreciate the effort. That's what mothers do, though. We clean up the messes, both literal and metaphorical, hoping that somehow our love will be enough to guide our children through the minefield of growing up. As I worked my way around the room, my eyes kept drifting to the space under his bed, that dark cavern where teenage secrets go to hide. I'd always respected his privacy, but lately, something had been eating at me, a gnawing worry that kept me awake at night. Ethan had been different these past few months, more withdrawn than usual, and that's saying something for a kid who'd always been on the quieter side. He used to talk to me about everything: school drama, his friends, his dreams of maybe studying engineering like his grandfather. But now, conversations felt forced, like he was performing the role of a normal teenager rather than actually being one. I'd catch him staring out his bedroom window for hours, lost in thoughts he refused to share, and when I'd ask if everything was okay, he'd just shrug and mumble something about being tired. The guidance counselor at school had called last week, mentioning that his grades were slipping and that he seemed emotionally distant in class. I'd tried to bring it up with him, but he'd shut down completely, retreating to his room like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Standing there in the middle of his room, surrounded by the detritus of his teenage life, I felt that familiar ache in my chest that every single mother knows too well. The weight of being everything to someone, of trying to fill the gaps left by an absent father, of wondering if you're enough, if you're doing it right, if your love can possibly compensate for all the things you can't provide. I'd been both mother and father to Ethan since he was 7 years old, when I made the hardest decision of my life and told him his father had died in a car accident. It was a lie, but it felt kinder than the truth, that his father had simply walked away, choosing his addiction over his family, leaving us both broken and abandoned. I thought I was protecting Ethan from the pain of rejection, from the confusion of having a father who was alive but didn't want to be part of his life. The dust bunnies under his bed seemed to mock me as I finally knelt down, armed with a vacuum cleaner and a determination to tackle this long overdue cleaning project. I'd always been meticulous about the rest of the house, but somehow Ethan's room had become this sacred space where I tread lightly, respecting his growing need for independence and privacy. As I pulled out the vacuum attachment and aimed it toward the shadowy space beneath his mattress, I told myself this was just about cleanliness, about being a responsible parent who maintained a healthy home environment. But deep down, I knew I was hoping to find some clue, some explanation for the change in my son, some tangible evidence of what was troubling him so deeply. Maybe it would be something innocent: old comic books, forgotten toys from his childhood, or even those magazines that teenage boys think they're so clever about hiding. The vacuum roared to life, drowning out the sound of my racing heartbeat as I maneuvered it under the bed frame. I could feel the resistance as it sucked up months of accumulated dust, loose change, and probably a few socks that had gone missing in the laundry cycle. But then the vacuum hit something solid, something that didn't belong in the usual collection of bedroom floor debris. I turned off the machine and reached under the bed, my fingers closing around what felt like a shoebox, though heavier than any shoebox had a right to be. My heart started beating faster as I pulled it out into the light, noting how carefully it had been positioned, not just shoved under there carelessly like everything else in his room. This box had been placed with intention, hidden with purpose, and suddenly I felt like I was crossing a line I'd never crossed before. The box was an old Nike shoe box, the kind that had once held his basketball sneakers from 2 years ago. But now it felt weighted with secrets. My hands trembled slightly as I held it, knowing that whatever was inside would change something between us, would shift the delicate balance of trust and privacy that we'd been maintaining. Part of me wanted to put it back, to pretend I'd never found it, to continue living in the comfortable ignorance of a mother who trusted her son completely. But the larger part of me, the part that had been losing sleep over his recent behavior, the part that had been fielding concerned calls from teachers and noticing the sadness in his eyes, knew that I had to look. I sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, the morning sun now streaming fully through his windows, and slowly lifted the lid of the box. What I found inside wasn't drugs, wasn't weapons, wasn't any of the terrible things that a mother's imagination conjures up when her teenage son starts acting strange. Instead, nestled carefully in the bottom of the box, were dozens of handwritten letters, each one folded with the precision of someone who had handled them countless times. The paper was worn soft at the edges, and I could see that some of the ink had smudged, as if tears had fallen on the pages. My breath caught in my throat as I picked up the first letter, my eyes immediately drawn to the address written in Ethan's careful handwriting, to Dad. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as I stared at those two simple words, because according to everything Ethan knew, according to the story I'd told him 10 years ago, his father was dead and buried in a cemetery across town. But here, in my hands, was proof that my son had been writing letters to a ghost, pouring his heart out to a man he believed he'd never see again. My hands shook as I unfolded the first letter, the paper soft and worn from being handled so many times. The date at the top was from 3 months ago, written in Ethan's neat handwriting that I'd helped him perfect during countless homework sessions at our kitchen table. "Dear Dad," it began, and those 2 words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. "I know you can't read this, but Mom says sometimes people who have passed away can still hear us, so maybe you'll know somehow." I had to stop reading and take a deep breath, my vision blurring as tears threatened to spill over. This wasn't what I had expected to find, and certainly not what I was prepared to handle on what was supposed to be a simple cleaning day. The innocence in his words, the hope that somehow his father might receive these messages from beyond the grave, made my stomach twist with guilt and regret. I forced myself to continue reading, each word cutting deeper than the last. "I made varsity basketball this year, and I keep thinking about how you would have been proud. Coach Martinez says I have natural talent, that I must have gotten it from somewhere. I wish I could remember more about you, but I was so young when you died." The letter went on to describe his games, his teammates, his dreams of maybe getting a scholarship to college. He wrote about me, too, about how hard I worked to provide for us, how he worried that I was lonely, how he wished I would date someone so I wouldn't have to carry everything alone. Reading his words felt like looking into his soul, seeing all the thoughts and feelings he'd been keeping locked away from me. I realized that while I thought I was protecting him from pain, he'd been carrying a different kind of pain all along, the pain of missing someone he'd never really known. The second letter was dated a month later, and the tone was different, more desperate somehow. "Dad, I've been having these dreams about you lately. In them, you're not dead. You're just somewhere far away, and I keep trying to find you, but I can never quite reach you. I wake up feeling so confused, like maybe Mom got something wrong about what happened to you." My blood ran cold as I read those words, realizing that somehow, on some level, Ethan's subconscious was rejecting the lie I'd told him. Children have an intuition about these things, a way of sensing when the stories don't quite add up, even when they can't articulate why. I thought about all the times he'd asked questions about his father over the years, how he'd wanted to visit the grave that didn't exist, how I'd made excuses about the cemetery being too far away or too painful for me to visit. As I continued reading through the letters, a pattern emerged that broke my heart into smaller and smaller pieces. Ethan had been writing to his father about everything. His first heartbreak when Sarah Jenkins didn't want to go to the spring dance with him, his anxiety about college applications, his confusion about what he wanted to do with his life. He'd been seeking guidance from a dead man, asking for advice that would never come, pouring out his teenage soul to someone who existed only in the story I'd created. "Sometimes I wonder what kind of man you were," he he wrote in one letter. Mom doesn't like to talk about you much, and I understand because it makes her sad, but I wish I knew more. Did you like sports? Were you funny? Did you ever feel as lost as I do sometimes? The questions he asked were the same ones that had been haunting me for years, the ones I'd been too afraid to answer honestly. One letter, dated just 2 weeks ago, made me gasp out loud. Dad, I think Mom has been lying to me about something, but I don't know what. Yesterday I was helping her organize old photos, and I found one of you that she thought she'd hidden. You were holding me when I was maybe 6 or 7, not a baby like she always said. If you died when I was 7, why don't I remember you at all? Why don't I remember the accident, or the funeral, or being sad? I've been trying so hard to remember, but it's like there's this blank space where you should be. I could barely breathe as I read his words, realizing that my carefully constructed lie was crumbling, that Ethan was starting to piece together the inconsistencies in my story. The photo he mentioned was one I thought I'd destroyed years ago, but apparently I'd missed one, and now it was unraveling everything. The most recent letter was dated just last week, and the handwriting was messier, more emotional. I don't know what to believe anymore, Dad. I've been doing some research online, trying to find records of your accident, but I can't find anything. No newspaper articles, no police reports, nothing. It's like you just disappeared from the world without a trace. I'm scared to ask Mom about it because I can see how much pain she's in whenever your name comes up, but I need to know the truth. If you're really dead, then why can't I find any proof? And if you're not dead, then where are you? Why did you leave us? The raw pain in his words was like a knife twisting in my chest, and I realized that my attempts to protect him had instead created a different kind of torture, a confusion and doubt that was eating him alive from the inside. I sat there on his bedroom floor, surrounded by the evidence of my son's secret emotional life, and felt the weight of my deception crushing down on me. Every letter was a testament to the relationship he'd been trying to build with a father who wasn't dead, just absent by choice. I thought about David, Ethan's real father, probably living somewhere in Denver or maybe even farther away, completely unaware that his son had been writing him letters for months. David, who had chosen drugs over family, who had broken my heart and abandoned his child, who I'd decided was better off being mourned than missed. I'd made that choice 10 years ago, in a moment of desperation and heartbreak, thinking it would be easier for Ethan to grieve a dead father than to wonder why his living father didn't want him. As I carefully folded the letters and placed them back in the box, my mind raced with the implications of what I'd discovered. Ethan was 17 now, almost an adult, and he deserved the truth, no matter how painful it might be. But how do you tell your son that you've been lying to him for 10 years? How do you explain that his father isn't a tragic hero who died too young, but a broken man who chose addiction over responsibility? How do you prepare a teenager for the possibility that his father might reject him all over again if he tried to make contact? I looked around Ethan's room, seeing it with new eyes now, understanding that this space had been his sanctuary, not just from the world, but from the confusion and pain of not knowing who he really was or where he came from. The box of letters wasn't just hidden under his bed, it was hidden in his heart, and I was the one who had put it there. I placed the box back under Ethan's bed exactly where I'd found it, my hands still trembling from what I'd just discovered. But as I stood up and looked around his room, everything felt different now, charged with the weight of secrets and lies that had been festering for years. The basketball trophies on his shelf seemed to mock me. All those games where he'd looked up into the stands, probably wishing his father could see him play, not knowing that somewhere out there, David might actually be alive to witness his son's achievements. I walked to Ethan's desk and sat down in his chair, the same chair where he'd probably written those heartbreaking letters, pouring his soul out to a ghost I'd created. The afternoon sun was streaming through his window now, and I realized I'd been sitting on his floor reading for over 2 hours, completely lost in the devastating reality of what my lies had cost my son. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I saw Ethan's name on the screen. Staying after school for basketball practice. Home around 6. Such a normal, everyday message, but now it felt loaded with subtext. Was he really at practice, or was he somewhere else, maybe researching more about his father, trying to piece together the truth that I'd been hiding from him? I thought about all the times recently when he'd said he was staying late at school, all the occasions when he'd seemed distracted and distant. Maybe he'd been spending that time in the library, searching through old newspapers and online records, trying to find evidence of an accident that never happened. The thought made my chest tighten with anxiety and guilt. I'd created a mystery for my own son to solve, and he was slowly unraveling the threads of my deception with the determination of a teenager who knew something wasn't right. I found myself walking through our small house like a stranger, seeing everything through the lens of my newfound knowledge. The living room where we'd had countless conversations about his future, his dreams, his questions about his father, all of it felt tainted now by the lies I'd been telling. On the mantelpiece sat a framed photo of Ethan and me from his 16th birthday, both of us smiling at the camera, but I could see something in his eyes now that I'd missed before. A sadness, a searching quality, like he was looking for something that was always just out of reach. How many times had he stared at that photo and wondered why he couldn't remember his father, why the grief felt so abstract and distant? I'd robbed him of the chance to process his real emotions about abandonment, instead forcing him to manufacture grief for a death that never occurred. The kitchen felt like a crime scene as I stood there, remembering all the conversations we'd had at our small dining table. I could picture 7-year-old Ethan, his legs swinging from the chair that was too big for him, asking me why Daddy had to die, why God had taken him away. I remembered how I'd held him as he cried, how I'd made up stories about his father watching over him from heaven, how I'd promised that Daddy loved him very much and would always be with him in spirit. Every word had been a lie, but they'd felt necessary at the time, protective somehow. David had been spiraling deeper into addiction, showing up at our door at all hours, sometimes high, sometimes desperate for money, always breaking Ethan's heart with promises he couldn't keep. The final straw had been when he'd taken Ethan to the park and forgotten him there for 3 hours while he went to score drugs. I'd found my son sitting alone on a swing, crying and confused, and that night, I'd made the decision that would haunt us both for the next 10 years. I pulled out my laptop and for the first time in years, typed David's name into a search engine. My heart pounded as the results loaded, and there he was, alive, clean according to his social media profiles, working at a construction company in Colorado Springs, just 2 hours away from us. He looked older, weathered by the years, and probably by his struggles with addiction, but he was unmistakably Ethan's father. The resemblance was striking now that Ethan was older, the same strong jawline, the same dark eyes, the same way of tilting his head slightly when he smiled. David's Facebook page showed photos of him at work, at what looked like AA meetings, with friends who appeared to be fellow recovering addicts. There were no photos of other children, no evidence of a new family that might have replaced us in his affections. He looked lonely, actually, and I wondered if he ever thought about the son he'd left behind, if he ever regretted the choices that had cost him his family. As I scrolled through David's social media presence, I found myself searching for any mention of Ethan, any indication that he remembered he had a son. There was nothing obvious, but I noticed that every year on Ethan's birthday, David posted cryptic messages about thinking of someone special or hoping someone knows they're loved. Could these vague posts be about Ethan? Had David been carrying his own guilt and regret all these years, wondering about the child he'd abandoned? The possibility that he might actually want to reconnect with Ethan terrified me, because it would mean that my lie hadn't just protected my son from rejection, it had potentially prevented a reconciliation that might have been healing for both of them. I thought about all the Father's Day posts where David had shared quotes about second chances and redemption, and I wondered if he'd been trying to send a message that I'd never allowed Ethan to receive. The sound of a car door slamming outside jolted me back to reality, and I quickly closed the laptop, my heart racing as I realized Ethan was home early. I heard his key in the front door, followed by the familiar sound of his backpack hitting the floor and his basketball shoes being kicked off in the entryway. "Mom," he called out, and I could hear something different in his voice, a tension that hadn't been there this morning. I walked to the living room to greet him, trying to act normal, but I felt like my guilt was written all over my face. He looked at me with those dark eyes that were so much like his father's, and I wondered if he could sense that something had changed, if he could tell that I'd discovered his secret correspondence with the dead. "How was school?" I asked, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. Ethan shrugged, but he was studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Fine," he said, But then he paused, and I could see him weighing his words carefully. "Mom, can I ask you something about Dad?" The question hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around me. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading for 10 years, the conversation that would either destroy our relationship or finally set us both free from the web of lies I'd woven. I looked at my son, this almost man who had been writing letters to a ghost, and realized that the time for truth had finally come, whether I was ready for it or not. The question hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon, and I felt my mouth go dry as I looked into Ethan's eyes. There was something different about his expression today, a determination that I'd never seen before, as if he'd finally decided to stop accepting my evasive answers about his father. "What do you want to know?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper, though we both knew this conversation had been building for months, maybe years. He sat down on the edge of our couch, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, and I could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. This was my son, my baby, but he was also becoming a man who deserved the truth, no matter how painful it might be for both of us. I sat down across from him, my heart hammering against my ribs, knowing that whatever came next would change everything between us forever, and that the box of letters hidden under his bed had somehow led us to this inevitable moment of reckoning. "I've been having these dreams," Ethan began, his voice steady but quiet, "where Dad isn't dead, where he's just somewhere else. And I keep trying to find him, but every time I get close, he disappears." He looked up at me then, and I saw tears gathering in his eyes that reminded me so much of David's when he was struggling with his demons. "Mom, I need to know the truth. I've been doing research, and I can't find any record of his accident. No newspaper articles, no police reports, nothing. It's like he just vanished from existence, and I don't understand how that's possible." The words I'd been dreading for a decade were finally being spoken, and I felt like I was drowning in the weight of my own deception, realizing that my son had been living with confusion and doubt, questioning his own memories and sanity, because I'd been too afraid to tell him that his father had chosen drugs over family, abandonment over responsibility. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out, because how do you begin to unravel a lie that's been the foundation of your child's understanding of himself for 10 years? "He's not dead, is he?" Ethan asked, and the question was so direct, so matter-of-fact, that it took my breath away. I looked at my son, this young man who had been writing letters to a ghost, who had been carrying the weight of manufactured grief for years, and I knew I couldn't lie to him anymore. "No," I said, the word falling from my lips like a stone into still water, and I watched helplessly as the foundation of his world shifted beneath him. "Then where is he?" he asked, his voice barely controlled, and I could see the anger building behind his eyes like a storm gathering strength. "Why did you tell me he was dead? Why have I been grieving for someone who's alive? How could you lie to me about something so important?" The questions came faster now, each one hitting me like a physical blow, and I realized that my attempt to protect him from rejection had instead created a different kind of torture, one that had been eating away at him for months as he tried to piece together a truth that didn't exist. "Your father was sick," I began, trying to find the right words to explain addiction to someone who had never experienced it, but Ethan wasn't ready to hear explanations. He wanted answers, he wanted his father, and he wanted me to help him find the man I'd told him was dead. 3 weeks later, I found myself sitting in a coffee shop in Colorado Springs, my hands wrapped around a cup that had long gone cold, watching the door and waiting for a reunion I'd never thought would happen. Ethan sat beside me, his leg bouncing nervously under the table, checking his phone every few minutes, even though we both knew David would be exactly on time. Punctuality had been one of his few reliable traits, even during his worst days. I'd made the call 2 days after our confrontation, my fingers shaking as I dialed the number I'd found online, and David's voice on the other end had broken with emotion when I told him that Ethan wanted to meet him. "I've been clean for 4 years, he'd whispered into the phone. "And not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about him, haven't wondered if he was okay, if he hated me for leaving." The conversation had lasted 2 hours, filled with apologies and explanations, and the careful negotiation of a meeting that could either heal old wounds or create new ones. Now, as I watched my son's face, I saw a mixture of anticipation and terror that mirrored my own feelings, because we were all about to discover whether love could survive the damage that addiction and lies had inflicted on our family. The door chimed, and David walked in, looking older and more weathered than his social media photos had suggested, but unmistakably Ethan's father in every line of his face and every gesture of his body. He spotted us immediately. There was no mistaking the resemblance between father and son, and I watched as 17 years of separation collapsed into a single moment of recognition. Ethan stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor, and for a heartbeat, neither of them moved, just stared at each other across the crowded coffee shop like they were seeing ghosts. Then David's face crumpled, and he whispered, "Ethan," like a prayer, and my son, my brave, angry, confused son, walked across that space and let his father pull him into an embrace that was 10 years overdue. I sat there watching them hold each other, both of them crying, both of them trying to bridge a gap that my lies had created, and I realized that sometimes the most loving thing a mother can do is step back and let her child find his own way to healing. The letters Ethan had written to his dead father were still hidden under his bed, but now he could write new ones, real ones, to the man who was very much alive and desperately wanted to be part of his son's life again. As I watched David and Ethan sit down together, their heads bent close as they began the long process of getting to know each other again, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I'd been carrying for a decade. My son would probably never fully forgive me for the lies I'd told, and our relationship would need time and work to heal from the damage my deception had caused. But seeing him with his father, seeing the way David's eyes lit up when Ethan talked about basketball and college plans and all the dreams he'd been sharing with a ghost, I knew I'd made the right choice in finally telling the truth. David wasn't the same broken man who had chosen drugs over family. He was someone who had fought his way back from the edge and earned the right to know his son. And Ethan wasn't the confused, grieving child who had been writing letters to heaven. He was a young man who deserved to have all the pieces of his identity, even the complicated ones. As I sat there in that coffee shop, watching my son discover that his father was real and flawed and human and present, I realized that sometimes the greatest act of love is admitting that you were wrong, and that the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than the most beautiful lie.